May 28, 1940. The Reich Air Ministry in Berlin was buzzing with nervous energy as reports from the Western Front arrived by the hour. France was collapsing under the thunder of German panzers, and the Luftwaffe, already feared across Europe, seemed unstoppable. In this atmosphere of triumph, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring leaned back in his chair, a smirk spreading across his broad face as he scanned a fresh intelligence report. It carried news from Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had asked Congress to authorize the production of 50,000 planes a year. To Göring, the claim was laughable. He set the report down with contempt, remarking to his staff, "The Americans are desperate if they believe such propaganda will frighten us. They know nothing of war production. Let them try to convert their automobile factories. They will soon learn that building warplanes requires more than assembly lines." His officers chuckled obediently. They trusted their commander, and Göring trusted his prejudice. The irony is sharp in retrospect. What Göring dismissed that day was not propaganda, but a prophecy of industrial thunder he could scarcely imagine. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt's words had rung out in Congress just days earlier, on May 16, 1940. German tanks were slicing through France, and Britain's fate hung in the balance. Yet Roosevelt stood firm, declaring, "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." It was a number so audacious, so astronomical, that even America's closest allies doubted it. Britain, desperate for any sign of help, quietly wondered if Roosevelt was bluffing. In 1939, after all, the United States had produced only 3,000 C-11 military aircraft. Many of its Army Air Corps planes were outdated relics. A leap from 3,611 to 50,000 sounded not just improbable, it sounded impossible. But Roosevelt understood something Göring did not. America was a land of vast untapped capacity, a giant of industry whose true strength had never been tested in modern war. Roosevelt knew that numbers could inspire as much as they could intimidate. His call was not simply for machines, but for belief. The belief that America could rise to a challenge greater than any it had faced before. In Berlin, Göring scoffed at the idea of turning car plants into aircraft factories. To him, it revealed only naivety. Yet behind the arrogance lay his own insecurity. Göring was already aware that German industry was straining, stretched to its limits by rearmament and blitzkrieg. He masked this reality with bravado. To admit that the Americans might achieve such a goal was to acknowledge that the Luftwaffe's dominance could someday be eclipsed. Better to laugh. What Göring and his staff could not see was that in Detroit, a man who once built Buicks and Cadillacs was already sketching out blueprints for a miracle. William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to the presidency of General Motors, had just accepted Roosevelt's call to serve. Knudsen traded a $300,000 salary for a symbolic $1 wage, determined to transform America's scattered factories into the greatest war machine in history. For now, however, the Americans looked unprepared, almost pitiful, in comparison to the blitzkrieg roaring across Europe. Göring's laughter that day echoed with the confidence of a conqueror. He believed his air force invincible, his nation destined to dominate. He believed America was a land of soft hands and consumer gadgets, incapable of producing weapons on the scale required by modern war. It is a moment that history remembers not for the laughter itself, but for its blindness. Göring had been handed a glimpse of the future, and he threw it aside with a sneer. His dismissal of Roosevelt's challenge would become one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the 20th century. For as the Reichsmarschall laughed in Berlin, across the ocean, an industrial colossus was stirring from its slumber. The storm that would bury the Luftwaffe had already begun to form. When Roosevelt stood before Congress in May 1940 and demanded the impossible 50,000 planes a year, he was speaking to a nation that had little resembling a modern air force. The United States was still emerging from the shadows of the Great Depression, a country whose attention had been fixed on breadlines, not battlefields. For 2 decades, America had embraced isolationism, clinging to the hope that oceans could shield it from Europe's endless wars. Its military budget reflected that hope, or perhaps that illusion. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps possessed barely 1,500 combat aircraft. Most of them were antiquated biplanes or early monoplanes that would have been outclassed even in the skies of Spain during the Civil War. Against the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s that roared over France, American aircraft looked like fragile museum pieces. Roosevelt's demand for a 14-fold increase in production seemed almost delusional. The reality of America's industrial output reinforced this skepticism. In the year 1939, U.S. factories had produced only 3,711 military aircraft, scarcely a month's work for German plants already churning out machines at wartime pace. American aviation companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed were small compared to the behemoths of Detroit. Their assembly halls employed thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Their expertise lay in limited runs of civilian airliners, not the ceaseless rhythm of mass military production. Even America's allies doubted Roosevelt. British envoys in Washington whispered that the president's call was more about morale than reality. The United States was rich, yes, but wealth alone did not translate into modern armies. Britain's factories were already under blackout, their windows taped against bombs, their workers sleeping in shelters before dawn shifts. By contrast, America's factories still made washing machines, refrigerators, and chrome-trimmed cars. Could such a society truly retool itself for war? The skepticism was not limited to foreigners. Within Congress and the War Department, doubts echoed. Generals fretted about logistics. Where would the aluminum come from? The engines? The trained workers? The runways to handle the aircraft once they were built? Senators complained about costs in a nation still climbing out of economic ruin. To many, Roosevelt's target looked like theater, a grand gesture meant to reassure Britain, nothing more. And yet, beneath the disbelief lay raw potential. The United States was the world's largest industrial power, its factories unmatched in scale and its workers unmatched in skill. Its automobile industry alone dwarfed the economies of entire nations. In Detroit, assembly lines had long since mastered the art of producing a car every minute. If such a system could be adapted for war, then perhaps Roosevelt's fantasy could become fact. But in 1940, this was still a dream. The army remained small, ranking 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The Navy, though proud, was unprepared for global war. American aviation was a curiosity, not a force. For every gleaming new Boeing B-17 flying fortress that rolled off the line, there were a dozen obsolete trainers or flimsy biplanes still in service. On paper, America was unready. Its skies were defended by little more than symbols, its arsenal thin and scattered. Roosevelt's proclamation was like demanding skyscrapers rise from empty fields. Goering's laughter seemed justified. How could a nation so unarmed, so slow to rouse itself, hope to produce more aircraft than all of Europe combined? Yet history often pivots on moments when impossibility becomes necessity. Roosevelt had planted a seed, not in metal or engines, but in imagination. The challenge was laid down, not only to Congress and industry, but to the American people themselves. They did not yet know it, but within 4 years, that seed would grow into a forest of aluminum wings, darkening skies from Normandy to Tokyo. For the moment, however, America stood unprepared, an industrial giant still half asleep, unaware of the storm it was about to unleash. If Roosevelt's vision was the spark, then William Knudsen was the man who knew how to turn it into fire. Few figures embodied the promise of America more than this Danish immigrant who arrived in New York in 1900 with little more than a toolbox and determination. His journey from bicycle mechanic to the head of the world's largest industrial enterprise was already remarkable. But history would reserve for him an even greater role, architect of America's arsenal of democracy. Knudsen's story was classic American. Born in Copenhagen in 1879, he had trained as a machinist before deciding to seek opportunity across the Atlantic. In New York, he found work in shipyards and machine shops before catching the attention of the Ford Motor Company in 1911. There, Knudsen's genius blossomed. He mastered Henry Ford's revolutionary moving assembly line and quickly rose through the ranks, overseeing the production of the Model T, the very machine that put America on wheels. By the 1920s, Knudsen's reputation as a master of mass production was unchallenged. He left Ford to join General Motors, where he transformed Chevrolet into a powerhouse brand and eventually rose to the presidency of GM itself. Knudsen's gift was not invention, but organization. He understood factories the way a conductor understands a symphony, how men, machines, parts, and schedules must flow together to produce harmony. By the 1930s, he was perhaps the single most experienced production engineer in the world. It was this reputation that caught Roosevelt's eye in May 1940. The president knew that military men alone could not build the arsenal he envisioned. What he needed was someone who had already commanded vast industrial armies of workers and machines. Knudsen was the natural choice. Roosevelt called him to Washington and asked a staggering question: could America's scattered peacetime industries be harnessed for war? Knudsen did not hesitate. Knudsen approached the problem, as he always had, practically, methodically, relentlessly. He toured factories across the country, talking not only to executives, but also to machinists and foremen. He made notes on what machines could be converted, which companies had spare capacity, and which raw materials would bottleneck first. Where military officers thought in terms of squadrons and battalions, Knudsen thought in terms of rivets, dies, furnaces, and presses. To the generals, his ideas sometimes sounded strange. Why should automobile giants like Ford, Chrysler, and GM be asked to build aircraft? Why should refrigerator manufacturers be asked to make machine guns? But Knudsen knew better than anyone that America's strength lay not in specialized plants, but in its sprawling web of civilian industries. He understood that a nation which could produce 5 million cars a year could surely produce tanks and planes, if only someone could redesign the assembly lines. His task was monumental. Airplane factories were few, and their methods artisanal. A skilled crew might take weeks to finish a bomber by hand. Knudsen envisioned something else entirely: bombers built like Buicks, rolling off production lines with clockwork rhythm. To make that happen, he had to persuade industrialists to take risks, to retool their plants, and to commit resources long before profits were guaranteed. Not everyone believed it could be done. Skeptics muttered that Knudsen was dreaming, that America's car plants could never produce precision aircraft engines or the delicate skin of a bomber as fuselage. But Knudsen had spent a lifetime proving doubters wrong. His faith was in the system of American industry itself, a vast network of machine shops, subcontractors, and suppliers that, once mobilized, could produce anything in almost limitless quantities. In the summer of 1940, as France fell and Britain stood alone, Knudsen began laying the foundations of a miracle. Quietly, he drew up production targets, mapped out supply chains, and began assigning contracts. He met with Henry Ford, Charles Sorensen, and other titans of industry, urging them to prepare for an industrial war unlike any the world had seen. He was not a soldier, but he understood what generals did not. Wars were not only won on battlefields, but in factories. The immigrant who once filed metal in a Copenhagen workshop was now preparing to mobilize the might of a continent. America was still unready, its factories still humming with peacetime goods. But under Knudsen's guiding hand, the transformation had begun. By late 1940, the scale of the challenge was beginning to reveal itself. Roosevelt's proclamation of 50,000 planes a year was no longer just a line in a speech. It was a mandate. Yet the path from promise to production was anything but straightforward. America's factories, still producing Buicks, refrigerators, and typewriters, had to be converted into engines of war. The task was unprecedented in scope. It was not merely a question of building planes and tanks. It meant reshaping the very skeleton of the American economy. William Knudsen knew this better than anyone. Walking the factory floors of Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, he saw the heartbeat of America's industrial muscle and its limits. Automobile plants were fast and efficient, but they had never worked with the alloys, tolerances, and aerodynamic complexities that aircraft demanded. A Buick fender could be stamped out in minutes, but the curved aluminum skin of a bomber required 1,000 rivets, each placed with precision. Retooling would take time, money, and above all, belief. That belief had to be cultivated not only in factories but also in boardrooms. Many industrialists hesitated. Why should they gamble their machinery, their workers, their profits on a war that America wasn't even fighting yet? Isolationist voices in Congress echoed their concerns. The slogan, "America First," still resonated with millions. To many, Roosevelt's plans seemed like overreach, dragging a reluctant nation into Europe's nightmare. But Roosevelt understood the stakes. With Britain reeling under the Blitz and German bombers reducing London to rubble, America could not afford hesitation. In December 1940, he spoke directly to the American people in one of his most famous fireside chats. His words crystallized the mission. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." The phrase electrified the nation. Factories that had once made washing machines were suddenly taking contracts for rifles. Typewriter companies like Remington were retooled to produce machine guns. Singer, the sewing machine manufacturer, began making pistols. Automobile giants Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler accepted the challenge of turning out tanks, jeeps, and eventually aircraft by the tens of thousands. Still, progress was uneven. Contracts bogged down in bureaucracy, engineers struggled to adapt designs to mass production, and labor disputes occasionally flared. Knudsen often found himself less an engineer than a diplomat, shuttling between executives, generals, and union leaders. His mantra was simple: speed before perfection. America had no time for artisan methods. The only way to meet Roosevelt's targets was through scale, through assembly lines that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. Perhaps no project symbolized this awakening better than Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. Conceived in 1941, it was designed to build the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, an aircraft so complex that it had previously taken 200,000 man-hours to complete. Ford's audacious promise was to reduce that to a rhythm of one bomber per hour. Skeptics called it impossible. Knudsen, however, knew better. The impossible was exactly what America now had to achieve. Meanwhile, in towns and cities across the country, ordinary Americans were beginning to grasp the magnitude of the coming effort. Men who had once built cars now studied blueprints of tanks. Women who had once sewn dresses began riveting steel plates. The industrial colossus was stirring, though not yet at full stride. By the end of 1940, production numbers were creeping upward, but the vast leap to 50,000 planes a year still seemed like a dream. Yet dreams were powerful fuel. Roosevelt's words, Knudsen's plans, and the gathering momentum of contracts and conversions were laying the groundwork. America was not at war, but the arsenal of democracy was awakening. And when the blow finally came, when bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the nation would be ready to move not with hesitation, but with thunder. While William Knudsen and Roosevelt quietly reshaped America's industrial destiny, Berlin remained wrapped in a cocoon of arrogance. The Reich's leaders saw the United States not as a sleeping giant, but as a clumsy, decadent society, incapable of serious war. Their blindness was not accidental, it was rooted deep within Nazi ideology. Adolf Hitler himself dismissed America as a mongrel nation, a place of immigrants, Jews, and what he called racial inferiors. In his view, such a country could never possess the discipline or willpower to wage modern war. Hermann Göring echoed the sentiment, scoffing that America's supposed productivity was built on luxuries, not necessities. What could a nation of consumers, of jazz and Hollywood, know about the grim science of total war? This contempt shaped German strategy. In 1940 and 1941, the Nazi leadership focused on Britain and the Soviet Union, calculating that America could at best play the role of supplier. Even the possibility of American weapons flowing to Britain through Lend-Lease was minimized in Berlin's war councils. German generals and planners believed the Atlantic Ocean was America's prison. That distance, not determination, would keep Roosevelt's promises hollow. But contempt clouded judgment. Göring's Luftwaffe officers laughed at the idea of American automobile factories producing aircraft. not realizing that those same factories already outproduced the entire German aviation industry many times over in civilian goods. Hitler mocked Roosevelt's speeches, labeling them empty boasting. Few in the Reich Air Ministry paused to consider what might happen if the President's boasts proved true. At the heart of this blindness was racism. The Nazis could not conceive that a society built on diversity and immigration might also be a society of boundless innovation. They ignored the evidence before their eyes. William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant, was orchestrating the mobilization of America's industry. Albert Einstein, another immigrant, had already sounded the alarm about atomic power. Refugee scientists, engineers, and thinkers from across Europe were pouring their talents into American institutions. To the Nazis, these men were undesirable. To America, they became pillars of strength. This ideological contempt was not merely rhetorical. It carried consequences on the battlefield. By underestimating America's potential, Germany gambled that the war could be won quickly in Europe before the United States could matter. Hitler repeatedly told his generals that the Americans were soft, that they could not endure mass casualties, that their soldiers would crumble when faced with the iron will of the Wehrmacht. Reality would prove otherwise. When the United States entered the war, it did not come as a hesitant amateur, but as an industrial titan. Within months, American factories were churning out planes, ships, and tanks in quantities that dwarfed German output. What Goering had mocked as propaganda became steel, aluminum, and firepower on an unimaginable scale. And yet, in 1940, the blindness was complete. In Berlin, laughter echoed through the marble halls of the Air Ministry. Roosevelt's speech was dismissed as a bluff. America was dismissed as weak, decadent, and racially inferior. Nazi ideology demanded this conclusion, even as reality quietly prepared to contradict it. Thus, contempt became a trap. While Hitler and Goering indulged in their prejudices, Roosevelt and Knudsen were building a storm across the ocean, an arsenal of democracy that would one day blot out the skies of Germany itself. If the arsenal of democracy had a cathedral, it was Willow Run. Conceived in 1941 as the largest factory of its kind in the world, the plant was Henry Ford's audacious pledge to prove that bombers could be built like automobiles. By the thousands on assembly lines stretching farther than the eye could see. Its mission: mass-produce the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber with the wingspan of a small house and the complexity of a watch. On paper, Willow Run was a miracle. Designed to cover 3.5 million square feet, its mile-long assembly line was intended to deliver one completed bomber every hour. Ford's engineers, led by Charles Sorensen, sketched plans of stamping giant fuselage sections the way they once pressed car doors, and of riveting crews working in tight choreography, transforming raw aluminum into flying fortresses. But dreams do not instantly become steel. The first months of Willow Run were chaos. The plant was rushed into operation before it was fully ready. Machinery broke down, supply chains lagged, and workers, many of them hired straight off farms or out of high schools, struggled to adapt to the precision demanded by aviation. Unlike cars, bombers could not simply be bolted together. They required tolerances measured in fractions of an inch, and every rivet carried the weight of life or death. Then came the human challenge. Willow Run drew tens of thousands of workers from across the Midwest, transforming quiet Michigan farmland into a city of migrants. Housing shortages, poor sanitation, and endless commutes bred frustration. Labor turnover soared. Some weeks, 1 in 5 workers quit. The dream of one bomber an hour seemed laughably distant when, in 1942, the plant managed only one finished bomber every month. Critics pounced. Newspapers sneered at Ford's bomber fiasco. Generals fretted that precious resources were being wasted. Within the War Department, whispers grew that perhaps Knudsen and the auto barons had overreached, that cars and planes truly were worlds apart. For Roosevelt's promise of 50,000 aircraft a year, the failure of Willow Run loomed like a fatal flaw. But Ford's engineers refused to surrender. Sorensen, nicknamed Cast Iron Charlie for his stubbornness, lived at the plant for weeks at a time, sleeping on a cot near the assembly line. Slowly, methodically, the kinks were ironed out. Training programs taught workers the difference between stamping steel and riveting aluminum. Supply bottlenecks eased as subcontractors across the nation were roped into the vast web of production. The line accelerated, first to a trickle, then a flow. By 1943, the transformation was visible. Bombers began rolling out in numbers that astonished even the skeptics. The one-an-hour goal, once a fantasy, became reality. Willow Run reached peak output in 1944, delivering 650 bombers in a single month. More aircraft than many nations had produced in the entire war. The B-24, derided early as too complicated for mass production, became the most built heavy bomber in history, with over 18,000 units completed. The struggle of Willow Run was more than an industrial challenge. It was a symbol of America's ability to adapt, to stumble and recover, to turn chaos into order. Where Germany saw only weakness and softness, the United States revealed resilience. What began as a fiasco ended as triumph, and the skies over Europe soon thundered with squadrons of liberators born in a Michigan cornfield. By 1943, the laughter in Berlin had gone quiet. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now trembled with the drone of engines that seemed endless, unyielding, and unmistakably American. What Hermann Göring had mocked as Roosevelt's propaganda number was materializing in aluminum and firepower. Squadrons of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, many from Willow Run, now filled the horizon, their contrails scratching white scars across the blue. At first, German civilians looked up with disbelief. The scale of the American bomber streams was something no one had seen before. Miles-long formations, layer upon layer stretching from horizon to horizon. The Luftwaffe scrambled its fighters, but the math was already turning against them. Every month, America delivered more planes than Germany could replace. For every downed bomber, 2 more appeared. For every destroyed Messerschmitt, Detroit and Willow Run sent engines, airframes, and replacement pilots pouring into Europe. The strategy was brutal and simple: daylight precision bombing. American commanders believed in striking Germany's industrial heart while the sun still shone, when bombs could be aimed at factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. It was costly. Casualties among bomber crews soared, but it was relentless. Cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and later Berlin itself felt the hammer blows. Assembly halls that once built tanks and fighters were reduced to smoking rubble. For Göring, the humiliation was personal. He had once promised Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich. By 1943, his words rang hollow. Entire regions lived under constant sirens, and civilians huddled in bunkers as flying fortresses roared overhead. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin on the Eastern Front and bleeding fuel reserves, could not stop the tide. Pilots who survived spoke of skies so thick with enemy bombers that it felt like trying to fight a thunderstorm with a pocket knife. What stunned German intelligence was not just the quantity, but the speed of American production. Factories across the Atlantic, many guided by Knudsen's planning, now delivered aircraft in weeks, not months. By the time a new model of German fighter reached the front, the Americans had already produced thousands of planes to counter it. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, found itself locked in a war of attrition it could not win. And still, the formations grew. By late 1943, missions involving 1,000 bombers at once became routine. A sky once guarded by Göring's vaunted eagles was now blackened by the very machines he had scorned. The laughter of 1940 had curdled into silence, then into dread. Germany had underestimated not only American machines, but the will of a nation that could retool its entire society for war. The storm that Roosevelt promised had arrived. Over Germany, daylight itself seemed to belong to America. And every mile-long shadow cast by those bombers was a reminder of a fatal arrogance, the blindness to what American industry, once awakened, could do. By 1944, America's industrial might had reached a tempo the world had never witnessed before. What had begun as Roosevelt's audacious dream was now a living, roaring reality. Factories that seemed to stretch without end, stamping, riveting, welding, and rolling out the hardware of global war. From coast to coast, the rhythm of mass production became the pulse of the nation. In Detroit, the same lines that once turned out Buicks and Chevrolets now produced tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines by the tens of thousands. At Willow Run, the B-24 Liberator rolled off the line in such numbers that bomber groups overseas could be replenished almost overnight. In California, Douglas and Lockheed plants swarmed with workers turning out sleek fighters and transports. In Pennsylvania, steel mills poured molten rivers to feed the insatiable demand for armor and shipbuilding. It was not just aircraft. Liberty ships slid into the water faster than U-boats could sink them. One ship launched every few days, sometimes every few hours. The Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast built entire convoys in weeks, collapsing the timetable of naval warfare. American tank plants in Illinois and Michigan flooded Europe with Shermans, while munitions factories produced enough bullets, shells, and bombs to feed not one war, but several. The statistics defied imagination. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft a year, double Roosevelt's original challenge. Tank output exceeded 25,000 annually. More than 2,700 Liberty ships had been launched, carrying the arsenal across oceans. The numbers dwarfed Axis production, overwhelming not only Germany but also Japan. Where the Reich relied on meticulous craftsmanship, America relied on scale, an industrial tide that no enemy could match. Inside the factories, the transformation was just as profound. Women by the millions filled jobs once closed to them, their hands guiding rivet guns and welding torches. Rosie the Riveter was more than propaganda. She was reality. Housewives, clerks, and farm girls who became the backbone of the war economy. Alongside them stood African Americans, Mexican Americans, and immigrants who, despite discrimination, poured their labor into the common cause. America's diversity, scorned by the Nazis as weakness, had become its greatest strength. The factories themselves became symbols of inevitability. Visitors described the sight of endless rows of machines, their stamping presses pounding like giant hearts, their conveyor belts carrying wings, fuselages, and engines through cavernous halls. At night, the glow of steel furnaces and welding arcs lit up skylines from Detroit to Los Angeles. The arsenal of democracy was not a metaphor anymore. It was visible, audible, tangible, a vast machine devouring raw material and spitting out weapons faster than the Axis could destroy them. For the Germans, each raid over their cities revealed the scale of their miscalculation. Every bomber shot down was instantly replaced. Every U-boat victory against a convoy was canceled by the launching of new ships. Every tank lost on the Eastern Front was matched tenfold by American production. Factories without end. That was the reality Roosevelt and Knudsen had forged. The United States had become not merely a combatant, but the industrial engine of the Allied world. The war was now fought not just with men and bullets, but with machines mass-produced in such staggering abundance that Axis resistance was doomed to collapse beneath the weight. In 1940, Goering had laughed. In 1944, his Luftwaffe pilots looked to the sky and saw proof that the laughter had died, drowned beneath the roar of engines built in factories that truly had no end. If the assembly lines were the arteries of America's war machine, then its workers were the lifeblood. And by 1943, that lifeblood had changed its face entirely. Factories once filled with men were now humming with the energy of women, minorities, and immigrants, people whom the Nazis dismissed as incapable, but who would prove decisive in the war of production. Rosie the Riveter became the face of this transformation, her rolled-up sleeve and defiant gaze symbolizing a social revolution as profound as the industrial one. Behind the posters, however, stood millions of real women, teachers who traded chalk for rivet guns, farm wives who welded steel, waitresses who packed parachutes. At Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant, 2/3 of the workforce were women. At Willow Run, Rosie the Riveter was not myth but flesh and blood. Workers like Rose Will Monroe, who could drive 3,000 rivets per shift with near-perfect precision. This sudden influx was not simply tolerated, it was engineered. Ford redesigned tools to fit smaller hands. Pneumatic rivet guns were lightened to reduce fatigue. Workstations were lowered, machinery repositioned, creating spaces where women could thrive. And in the process, efficiency soared. Inspectors, many of them women, reduced defect rates from over 3% to less than 1%. What German intelligence misread as desperation was, in truth, adaptation and innovation. And it wasn't only women. African Americans, long excluded from industrial jobs, joined the factories in unprecedented numbers. In Detroit, the Double V campaign took root. Victory against fascism abroad and against discrimination at home. Black workers riveted side by side with whites, though often in the face of resistance strikes and segregation. Despite these challenges, they became indispensable to the production miracle. In some plants, Mexican American and Native American workers joined the effort, while Japanese Americans, displaced by internment camps, ironically supplied farm labor that kept the home front fed. The labor force of wartime America was a mirror of the nation's contradictions. Unequal, divided, but united by necessity. It was not perfect solidarity, but it was real cooperation, and it produced results the Reich could never comprehend. Nazi planners saw only chaos in diversity. What they missed was resilience. A society that drew strength from many hands, many backgrounds, many voices could mobilize faster and sustain longer than one bound by ideology and fear. By 1943, women comprised 65% of the aircraft industry's workers, over 300,000 strong. They wired instrument panels, sewed parachutes, and inspected every bolt and seam with relentless precision. And when the war ended, they would not forget what they had done. The sound of their rivet guns was not only the sound of bombers being built, it was the echo of social change, a foretaste of battles yet to come in peacetime America. For Göring and Hitler, women in factories confirmed their prejudices, a desperate nation scraping the bottom of its barrel. But for the Allies, it was the opposite, a democratic nation revealing its secret strength, that free citizens, whatever their sex or origin, could rise to the challenge and do the impossible. The workforce revolution was not a footnote to the production miracle. It was the heart of it. Rosie the Riveter was more than a symbol. She was victory made flesh, rivet by rivet, wing by wing, bomber by bomber. And when those planes blackened the skies over Germany, it was her handiwork that blotted out the sun. While American factories roared with voluntary labor and humming assembly lines, Germany was descending into a different kind of industrial mobilization, one built on chains, starvation, and despair. By 1944, the Reich's so-called miracle weapons and jet programs were increasingly reliant on slave labor. It was a desperate attempt to match Allied output, but instead of efficiency, it produced tragedy. The crown jewel of this doomed system was the Mittelwerk complex near Nordhausen, where the Nazis forced tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners to build V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. The conditions were beyond horrific. Prisoners, already skeletal from hunger, worked 12 to 16 hours a day in darkness, surrounded by the stench of death. Disease spread unchecked. The air was thick with dust and exhaust from machinery. Corpses were carted out daily, their places quickly filled by new prisoners shipped in from Buchenwald and Dora. Of the 60,000 people who passed through Mittelbau-Dora, an estimated 20,000 died. Not in battle, but in the act of building weapons they would never live to see launched. This was not an isolated story. Across the Reich, production was dispersed into hundreds of underground facilities, as Allied bombing campaigns devastated surface factories. In February 1944, Göring authorized the Jägerstab, a crash program to relocate aircraft production into caves, tunnels, and mines. Slave laborers, Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, political prisoners, were crammed into these spaces under SS guard. Instead of precision, the system bred sabotage, loosened bolts, sugar poured into fuel tanks, wiring crossed to guarantee failure. And even when sabotage was absent, the inefficiency was staggering. Moving machinery underground slowed output. Transporting components between scattered sites created bottlenecks. With workers too weak to stand, quality collapsed. Engines failed. Aircraft rolled out with defects so severe they never reached combat. Entire batches had to be scrapped. The Nazis told themselves this was strength through willpower, forcing the impossible into existence. In truth, it was collapse disguised as determination. Each underground tunnel was a graveyard of both human lives and German hopes. While Willow Run alone could outproduce the entirety of the Reich's aviation industry, Germany poured men and material into holes in the earth, producing fewer and fewer usable machines at higher and higher human cost. The contrast could not have been more stark. In America, women riveters laughed and sang as they worked, fueled by coffee and union wages. In Germany, skeletal hands reached out of darkness, driven by whips and terror. One system built planes that darkened the skies. The other built corpses faster than aircraft. By late 1944, German officers quietly admitted what Hitler would not. The Reich was bleeding out in its factories as much as on the battlefield. Every attempt to replace lost planes or tanks only deepened the reliance on slave labor, and with it, the rot of sabotage and despair. In seeking salvation underground, the Reich had instead buried its future. June 6, 1944. The world awoke to the thunder of the largest amphibious invasion in history. On the shores of Normandy, young men from America, Britain, Canada, and across the free world braved walls of steel and fire. But even as the soldiers fought tooth and nail to carve out a foothold, the battle above them, the battle in the skies, was already decided before the first boots touched French sand. By dawn, swarms of Allied aircraft, thousands strong, darkened the horizon. Bombers thundered inland, hammering railways, bridges, and supply depots. Fighters prowled the skies, hunting down the Luftwaffe with near impunity. Overhead, the air belonged entirely to the Allies. For the German defenders, it was as if the heavens themselves had turned hostile. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the spear of Blitzkrieg, was a ghost of its former self. Outnumbered and outproduced, German pilots could do little more than scratch at the edges of the invasion. On D-Day itself, barely 300 German aircraft flew in defense, against nearly 12,000 Allied planes. Where were the vaunted Messerschmitts, the Focke-Wulfs, the jets whispered about in propaganda? Grounded, destroyed on airfields, starved of fuel, or waiting for spare parts that never came. And behind this imbalance lay the true legacy of the arsenal of democracy. For every German plane that reached Normandy, dozens of American-built Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Lightnings crowded the skies. Willow Run and its sister plants had flooded Europe with machines of war at a pace unimaginable to Berlin. In April alone, American factories delivered over 8,000 aircraft, more than the entire Luftwaffe could field across the continent. For the men storming Omaha and Juneau, this industrial miracle was the difference between life and death. Every strafing run that shattered a machine gun nest, every bomber squadron that tore apart a rail junction, every P-47 that dove through flak to silence artillery. These were the dividends of years of sacrifice on the assembly lines. Rosie, the riveter's rivets, Knudsen's production schedules, the sweat of Detroit, Seattle, and California, all converged in the skies above Normandy. German soldiers on the ground looked upward in despair. Reports from the front spoke of clouds of enemy aircraft without end. Officers cursed that reinforcements could not move by day, lest they be annihilated from the air. Hitler had promised the Atlantic Wall would be impregnable. But walls mean little when the sky itself is owned by the enemy. Normandy was not just a triumph of strategy or bravery. It was proof of a deeper truth. Wars are not won only on beaches, but in factories, in foundries, in the hands of workers whose faces the enemy never saw. On June 6, 1944, the arsenal of democracy showed its full power, not in speeches, but in wings that blotted out the sun and ensured that freedom's armies could land, fight, and march inland. As the Allies surged inland from Normandy, German propaganda reached for salvation in a single word: Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons. The regime promised jet fighters that would sweep the skies clean, rockets that would devastate London, tanks so heavy they could shrug off Allied fire. To a people reeling under bombing and defeat, these promises glittered like water in the desert. But like all mirages, they dissolved upon approach. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was perhaps the most famous of these weapons. Sleek, fast, and years ahead of its time, it could outrun and outgun any Allied plane. In theory, it was unstoppable. In reality, it was a machine without an ecosystem. Its jet engines wore out after just 25 hours of flight. Factories could not supply spare parts. Trained pilots were scarce, fuel scarcer still. Dozens of jets sat idle for everyone that flew. Allied pilots nicknamed them rare birds, dangerous in the air, but too few to matter. The V-1 and V-2 rockets carried terror across the skies of Britain. They killed civilians, leveled houses, and sowed fear. But they were militarily useless. Each V-2 consumed resources equivalent to a fighter plane, yet could deliver only a single ton of explosives with no accuracy. They killed fewer people than the bombs dropped nightly by one squadron of Lancasters or B-17s. For every life the V-weapons claimed, Allied factories were producing the means to save thousands more by ending the war faster. And then there were the monsters of steel, the Tiger II tanks, heavier than anything the Allies fielded. They were fortresses on treads, but also mechanical nightmares. Engines overheated, transmissions cracked, bridges collapsed under their weight. Many were abandoned by their own crews after breaking down, easy prey for Allied airstrikes and artillery. Germany had traded mass production for vanity, quantity for spectacle. The problem was not German ingenuity. It was German blindness. The Nazis saw technology as talismanic, as if a handful of superweapons could outweigh the industrial avalanche of America and the Soviet Union. But war is not won by prototypes, it is won by production. For every Me-262 the Reich produced, the United States built 100 Mustangs. For every Tiger II, the Soviets rolled out a dozen T-34s. For every V-2 rocket, Willow Run finished another B-24 bomber. Inside Germany, the faith in Wunderwaffe was a symptom of collapse. It was easier to believe in miracles than to face reality. That the skies were lost, the factories in ruins, the armies retreating. And so, even as Allied bombers darkened the skies, the German people were fed visions of invisible weapons that would turn the tide. The Mirage kept them moving forward, even as the desert of defeat stretched endlessly around them. In the end, the Wunderwaffe did achieve something, but only for the Allies. It drained German resources, wasted precious time, and accelerated defeat. When Hitler raged about miracle weapons in his bunker, he was not speaking of strategy, but of dreams. Against the arsenal of democracy, dreams were no match for reality. By late 1944, the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, once the peacock of Berlin, draped in metals and silks, was a man besieged by failure. Hermann Göring had promised Hitler that no enemy bomb would fall on the Reich, that the Luftwaffe would rule the skies as it had in 1940. Instead, the thunder above Germany came not from his fighters, but from Allied bombers blotting out the daylight. Cities burned, factories crumbled, railways splintered, and Göring's name became a curse whispered in bomb shelters. In Hitler's court, Göring had long thrived on arrogance and theater. He dismissed warnings of American industry as nonsense, mocked Roosevelt's speeches, and scoffed at the notion that mongrel democracies could match German willpower. Now, in the smoking ruins of Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, his boasts hung around his neck like chains. Each air raid was an accusation, each crater a reminder of promises unkept. Reports crossed his desk daily. Fuel stocks collapsing, pilots barely trained before being sent to their deaths, factories dispersed into caves where slave laborers worked themselves to death for machines that rarely flew. The Reich's once mighty Luftwaffe was a shell. In Normandy, it had been nearly absent. Over the Reich itself, it fought desperately but hopelessly, its numbers dwindling as America and Britain unleashed wave after wave of aircraft built in factories Göring had ridiculed. Even Hitler's faith began to falter. In tense conferences, he turned on Göring with fury, accusing him of cowardice, incompetence, even betrayal. Göring blustered as he always had, but the old confidence was gone. He begged for miracle weapons, for more time, for loyalty. None of it mattered. The Luftwaffe was broken beyond repair. Ordinary Germans, once enthralled by Göring's pomp, spat his name in disgust. Mothers in the ruins of Dresden cursed the man who had promised them safety. Soldiers at the front joked bitterly that Göring's air force lived only in posters. To many, he became the face of Germany as hollow arrogance, the man who believed victory could be declared into existence, while factories in America built victory into steel and wings. The reckoning was not just personal, it was symbolic. Göring's fall mirrored the collapse of the Nazi fantasy itself, the belief that ideology, willpower, and spectacle could triumph over numbers, science, and production. Where Göring had promised supremacy, he delivered only ruin. By the final months of the war, the Reichsmarshal who once strutted as master of the skies was reduced to irrelevance. He no longer commanded the air. He no longer commanded respect. He sat in his palaces dulled by morphine and despair, watching as the empire he had helped conjure unraveled from the ground up and from the skies down. Göring's reckoning was not a trial in court, not yet. It was the slow, suffocating realization that the arsenal of democracy had done what he had declared impossible. It had crushed his Luftwaffe, leveled his cities, and exposed his lies to the world.